The gunshot echoed across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, silencing even the howling autumn wind that had been tormenting the small frontier town since dawn. Grace Caldwell clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest and quickened her pace, ducking her head as she passed the saloon where several men lounged on the wooden porch, their eyes following her with unmasked contempt. At 22, Grace had already endured more suffering than most faced in a lifetime, but today promised to be particularly cruel. "There she goes," a voice called out, deliberately loud enough for her to hear. "Town disgrace with her bastard child." Grace's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The year was 1878, and the West was unforgiving to those who strayed from society's strict moral codes. As an unwed mother, Grace wore her shame like a brand, visible to all in the small Wyoming settlement she'd once called home with pride. "Ought to run her out of town," another voice chimed in. "Teaching our good women bad habits." The baby, little Emma, stirred against her chest as if sensing her mother's distress. Grace stroked her downy head and whispered soothing words. Emma was innocent despite what the townspeople believed. 5 months old and already facing a world determined to punish her for circumstances beyond her control. "Just need to get supplies," Grace murmured to herself, then back to the cabin. Her modest home sat on the outskirts of town, a small one-room structure that had belonged to her father. After his passing from influenza last winter, it was all she had left. That, and the crushing loneliness that had driven her into the arms of a charming cattle buyer passing through town, a man who had promised her the world, only to disappear when she told him about the child. The general store's bell jingled as Grace pushed open the door. Inside, Mrs. Parker, the owner's wife, was helping another customer. The moment Grace entered, conversation stopped. 2 women gathering supplies near the dry goods shelf turned their backs, their whispers barely concealed. "Good morning," Grace said politely to Mr. Parker behind the counter, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The storekeeper nodded curtly. "What'll you be needing?" Grace unfolded a small piece of paper from her pocket. "Just these essentials, please." As Mr. Parker gathered her items, Grace felt the weight of stares from other customers. Emma began to fuss, her tiny face reddening as she worked up to a cry. Grace bounced her gently, but the infant's wails soon filled the store. "Can't you keep that child quiet, Mrs.?" Parker snapped, appearing from the back room. "Decent folks are trying to conduct business." "I'm sorry," Grace said, her face flushing. "She's hungry, I think." "Should have thought about feeding schedules before you decided to parade your mistakes around town," Mrs. Parker replied coldly. The cruelty of the words struck Grace like a physical blow. Tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them back. She would not give them the satisfaction. "My purchases, please," she said softly to Mr. Parker, who looked uncomfortable but said nothing in her defense. The door to the general store swung open, the bell announcing another arrival. The tall figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight commanded immediate attention, causing conversations to halt once more. Bryce Callahan stepped inside, removing his dusty hat to reveal sandy brown hair that needed trimming. At 28, he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors, his skin tanned from the sun and his blue eyes sharp as they scanned the store. Bryce was relatively new to Redemption Creek, having arrived 6 months ago to work as a ranch hand at the nearby Silver Dollar Ranch. He kept to himself mostly, but his reputation as a skilled horseman and fair worker had already been established. Emma's cries grew louder and Grace felt the situation slipping from her control. The baby needed feeding, and the hostile environment only made matters worse. "That'll be $1.35, Mr. Parker said, bagging her meager supplies. Grace shifted Emma to one arm and reached into her pocket, only to feel her heart sink. The coins she'd counted carefully that morning weren't there. She checked her other pocket, then her small purse, panic rising. I must have dropped my money on the way," she said, mortification washing over her. "Could I possibly pay you tomorrow? I'll come back first thing." Mr. Parker's face hardened. "We don't extend credit, you know that." Please, I just need some milk and flour." "For the baby, should have thought about how you'd feed it before you went and got yourself in trouble," Mrs. Parker interjected loudly. The store fell completely silent. Grace stood frozen, the shame and humiliation threatening to suffocate her. Emma wailed louder, sensing her mother's distress. "I've got it," came a deep voice from behind her. Grace turned to see Bryce Callahan approaching the counter. He placed some coins next to her items. "This should cover the lady's purchases and mine as well." He handed Mr. Parker a short list of his own. "You needn't bother yourself with her troubles, Mr. Callahan," Mrs. Parker said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "She's made her bed." Bryce's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "I reckon we've all made beds we didn't want to lie in at some point, Mrs. Parker." He turned to Grace, who stood speechless, tears of gratitude and humiliation threatening to spill over. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll pay you back." "No need," he replied simply. Mrs. Tanner, one of the town's most notorious gossips, clicked her tongue loudly. "You're new here, Mr. Callahan, so perhaps you don't understand. That woman has brought nothing but shame to our decent community." Bryce picked up Grace's package from the counter and handed it to her. "Is that so? A woman alone with a child and no husband," Mrs. Tanner continued. "It's an affront to decent Christian values." Bryce looked at Grace, who stood tall despite the tears now streaming down her face, still trying to soothe her crying infant. Something in his expression softened. "Then I'll share it with you," he said, his voice carrying through the store. "I beg your pardon," Mrs. Parker sputtered. Bryce turned to face the onlookers squarely. "If she carries shame, then I'll help her carry it. Seems to me the only shameful thing here is how a town treats a mother and her innocent child." The stunned silence that followed was broken only by Emma's cries. Grace stared at Bryce, unable to comprehend why this virtual stranger would stand up for her. "You might want to reconsider your position in this town, Mr. Callahan," Mr. Parker warned. Bryce shrugged, collected his own purchases, and gestured toward the door. "Madam, may I walk you home? These packages might be difficult with the little one." Still speechless, Grace nodded. As they stepped outside into the harsh sunlight, she finally found her voice. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Bryce adjusted his hat against the sun. "My mother raised me and my 3 siblings alone after my father was killed in the war. I've seen firsthand how cruel people can be to a woman on her own." They walked in silence for a moment, Emma's cries gradually subsiding to whimpers. "I'm Grace," she said finally. "Grace Caldwell, and this is Emma." "Bryce Callahan," he replied with a nod. "How far is your place?" "About half a mile outside town, but you don't need to walk me all the way, I don't mind," he interrupted. "Unless you'd prefer I didn't." Grace considered his offer. Company, especially kind company, was a rarity these days. "I'd appreciate the help," she admitted. As they walked away from town, Grace felt the weight of stares following them, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel quite so alone in bearing them. The path to Grace's cabin took them through a sparse stretch of pine trees, following alongside a creek that bubbled cheerfully, oblivious to human concerns. Emma had finally settled, lulled by the rhythm of walking. "She looks like you," Bryce observed, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Grace smiled down at her daughter. "Yes, thankfully, she has my father's eyes, though, the same dark blue." She hesitated before adding, "It's one small mercy that she doesn't resemble her father at all." "The man who left?" Bryce asked simply, without judgment. Grace nodded. "Robert was passing through with a cattle drive. He was handsome, well-spoken. Said he was coming back for me after delivering the herd north." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "I was naive enough to believe him." "That doesn't make you naive," Bryce said. "Just trusting. There's a difference. The town doesn't see it that way." "The town," Bryce said, kicking a stone from the path, "seems quick to judge and slow to help." They crested a small hill, and Grace's cabin came into view. It was modest but sturdy, with a small vegetable garden to one side and a chicken coop that housed 3 hens. Smoke curled from the stone chimney Grace had banked the fire before leaving that morning. "It's not much," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's a home," Bryce replied. "That's what matters." Inside, the cabin was tidy despite its simplicity. A curtain partitioned off one corner where Grace's bed sat. A small cradle made of pine stood nearby. The main space contained a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a rocking chair near the hearth. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and shelves held the few books Grace owned. "Please sit," she offered, gesturing to one of the chairs while she settled Emma in her cradle. "I can make coffee to thank you." "That would be welcome," Bryce said, placing the packages on the table and taking a seat. He removed his hat, revealing the full extent of his son's streaked hair. Grace busied herself with the coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. "What brought you to Redemption Creek?" she asked. "Not many choose this place deliberately." Bryce leaned back in the chair. "I go where the work is, been moving around since the war ended. My family's farm in Missouri didn't survive too many men gone, not enough hands to work the land." "I'm sorry," Grace said, genuinely sympathetic. "It was a long time ago now," he replied. "But what about you? Have you always lived here?" Grace nodded as she placed the coffee pot on the stove. "Born and raised. My father was the town blacksmith until his health started failing." She looked around the cabin. "He built this place when he first arrived before I was born. My mother died when I was 12, lung fever. It was just the two of us after that." "And now just you and Emma," Bryce observed quietly. Grace nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "The town was kinder when my father was alive. He was respected when he died last winter. And then when they realized I was expecting." She trailed off, the memory of those first brutal months of ostracism still raw. "People fear what they don't understand," Bryce said. "And they don't understand strength in a woman alone." His words warmed something in Grace that had been cold for too long. "You speak as though you've seen much of the world, Mr. Callahan." "Bryce, please," he corrected with a small smile. "And yes, enough to know that the smallest towns often carry the biggest judgments." The coffee began to boil, and Grace poured 2 cups, setting one before him. Their fingers brushed as she handed him the cup, and a jolt of awareness passed through her that she immediately tried to suppress. Attachment was dangerous. She'd learned that lesson thoroughly. "Will you be staying in Redemption Creek long?" she asked, taking the seat across from him. "That depends on the work," he replied, "and other factors." "Other factors?" Bryce took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Whether there's reason to put down roots. I've been drifting a long time." The intensity of his gaze made Grace look away. "The Silver Dollar is a good ranch." "Mr. Henderson is fair from what I hear." "He is," Bryce agreed. "Treats his men well." He paused. "What about you? How do you manage?" Grace straightened her shoulders slightly. "I take in laundry from the mining camp up north. The men there don't care about my situation. And I sell eggs and vegetables when I have extra." She glanced toward the garden visible through the window. "It's not much, but it keeps Emma fed." "You're resourceful," Bryce said with admiration. "That's worth more than gold out here." They talked until the shadows grew long, Emma waking once for feeding. Grace excused herself behind the curtain for privacy, and Bryce respectfully busied himself examining the books on her shelf. When she returned, he was holding a well-worn volume of poetry, Wordsworth. He asked with a raised eyebrow. Grace blushed slightly. "My father believed in education, even for a daughter. He traded a custom saddle for a box of books from an educated Easterner passing through. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers." Bryce quoted softly. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "You know Wordsworth?" Now it was Bryce's turn to look slightly embarrassed. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married. She made sure we all had learning, even when times were hard." The revelation of this shared appreciation for literature created a new bridge between them. As the afternoon waned into evening, Grace realized she hadn't spoken so freely with anyone since her father died. "I should go," Bryce said finally, noticing the darkening sky outside. "I've taken enough of your time." Grace walked him to the door, Emma once again asleep in her cradle. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the supplies, but for the company. It's been rare lately." Bryce placed his hat back on his head. "May I call on you again, perhaps Sunday after church?" Grace's expression clouded. "I don't attend church anymore. Reverend Williams made it clear I wasn't welcome when I started showing with Emma." Anger flashed briefly in Bryce's eyes. Then Sunday afternoon, I have the day free. Hope flickered in Grace's heart, though she tried to temper it. I'd like that, she admitted. As she watched him walk away, Grace allowed herself to wonder if perhaps her fortunes were finally changing. Then she reminded herself that hope was a luxury she could ill afford. Men left, that was the one lesson life had taught her thoroughly. True to his word, Bryce returned that Sunday. He arrived carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper, which turned out to contain wooden blocks for Emma and a jar of honey from the ranch's hives. "Mr. Henderson keeps bees," he explained. "Said I could have some for helping repair the hives last week." That Sunday visit became a pattern. Each week, Bryce would arrive, sometimes with small gifts, a ribbon for Emma's hair, seeds for Grace's garden, or a new book he'd traded for in town. They would talk for hours, and occasionally he would stay for supper, insisting on bringing rabbit or fish he'd caught himself. As October turned to November, Grace found herself watching the path from town each Sunday, her heart leaping at the first sight of his tall figure cresting the hill. Emma, now 6 months old, seemed to recognize him too, gurgling happily whenever he entered the cabin. The town's treatment of Grace hadn't improved. If anything, Bryce's obvious attention had made matters worse, adding fuel to the gossip fires. But somehow, with his steady friendship, the sting of their rejection lessened. One crisp Sunday in mid-November, Bryce arrived looking troubled. Grace, who had come to read his expressions with increasing accuracy, noticed immediately. "What's happened?" she asked as he hung his hat on the peg by the door. Bryce ran a hand through his hair. "Henderson had a visitor yesterday, Robert Ainsley." Grace felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. "Robert, here?" Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Bryce nodded grimly. "Leading a cattle drive north just like last year. He'll be in town for a few days." He hesitated. "Grace, he was boasting about conquests along the trail." "Your name came up." Grace clutched the back of a chair for support, her knuckles whitening. "I see." She looked toward Emma, playing contentedly on a blanket near the fire. Did he mention?" "No," Bryce said quickly. "I don't think he knows about Emma." Relief and anger warred within Grace. Part of her wanted Robert to know about the child he'd left behind, another part feared what might happen if he did. "What will you do?" Bryce asked, his voice gentle but strained. Grace squared her shoulders. "Nothing. He means nothing to me or Emma now." Bryce studied her face. "You sure about that?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Whatever I thought I felt for him died long ago." The tension in Bryce's posture eased slightly. He crossed the room to where Emma was playing and crouched down beside her. The baby immediately reached for him, and he let her grab his finger with her tiny hand. "She's getting stronger," he observed, his expression softening as it always did around the child. "She is," Grace agreed, watching them together. Over the past weeks, she'd observed how natural Bryce was with Emma, how patient and gentle. It stirred feelings in her that she both welcomed and feared. Later, as they sat at the table sharing a meal of rabbit stew, Bryce cleared his throat. "Grace, there's something else I need to tell you." She looked up, alarmed by his serious tone. "What is it?" "Henderson offered me a permanent position as his foreman. The current man is getting too old for the work, wants to move east to live with his daughter." "That's wonderful," Grace said, genuinely pleased for him. "You deserve it." "It would mean staying in Redemption Creek," he continued, watching her carefully. "Putting down those roots I mentioned." Grace's heart quickened. I assumed you'd move on eventually." "I did too." His gaze was steady, "until I found reasons to stay." The implication hung in the air between them. Grace looked down at her bowl, afraid of the hope blooming in her chest. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her. They exchanged confused glances. Grace rarely had visitors, especially after dark. Bryce rose, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. "Stay here," he said quietly, moving to the door. When he opened it, Sheriff Collins stood on the porch, his expression grim. "Evening, Callahan. Need to speak with Miss Caldwell." Grace approached the door, anxiety tightening her chest. "Sheriff, what's happened?" "There's been some trouble in town, Miss Caldwell. Robert Ainsley's asking after you. He's drunk, making threats." Grace paled. "Threats? What kind of threats?" Says he's coming to claim what's his, the sheriff said uncomfortably. He's heard about the baby, Bryce's expression darkened, and you're just letting him make these threats. He hasn't broken any laws yet, the sheriff replied defensively, but I thought the lady should be warned. Thank you, Sheriff, Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. After the sheriff left, Grace began pacing the small cabin. He can't take her, he has no right. He won't get near either of you, Bryce promised. I'll stay tonight. Grace stopped pacing. You can't fight my battles for me, Bryce. I'm not fighting for you, he said firmly. I'm standing with you, there's a difference. The distinction wasn't lost on Grace. All her life, men had either controlled her or abandoned her. Her father had protected her, but even he had made decisions for her own good. Robert had wooed her with promises of taking care of everything, but Bryce spoke of partnership, of sharing burdens rather than assuming them. All right, she agreed, but tomorrow I need to face him myself. We'll face him together, Bryce corrected gently. That night, Bryce slept in the rocking chair by the fire while Grace and Emma took the bed behind the curtain. Despite the circumstances, Grace felt safer than she had in months, listening to Bryce's steady breathing in the quiet cabin. Morning came with a heavy frost that sparkled in the weak sunlight. Grace dressed carefully in her best dress of faded blue cotton that had once been her mother's. She fed and changed Emma, then wrapped her snugly against the cold. You don't have to go to town, Bryce said as he watched her preparations. He could come here. I won't hide, Grace replied, her chin raised. And I won't let him think he has any power over me or my home. Bryce nodded, respect evident in his expression. Then we go together. The walk to town felt both endless and too short. Grace rehearsed what she would say to Robert, the man who had promised her love and left her with nothing but shame and a child to raise alone. Anger bubbled inside her, replacing the hurt that had dominated for so long. The town was oddly quiet for a Monday morning. As they approached the main street, Grace saw a small crowd gathered outside the saloon, and there, standing on the porch, was Robert Ainsley, as handsome as she remembered, but with a hardness to his features she hadn't noticed before. He spotted her immediately, his eyes narrowing first at her, then at Bryce walking beside her, and finally at the bundle in her arms. So it's true, he called out, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. You've been busy while I was gone, Grace. Grace stepped forward, her heart hammering but her voice steady. What do you want, Robert? He descended the steps, swagger in his stride. Just came to check on an old flame, heard some interesting gossip about you having a baby. His gaze flicked to Emma. Looks about the right age to be mine. She's mine, Grace said firmly. Just mine. Robert laughed, the sound grating. That's not how it works, sweetheart. If that's my child, I have rights. Rights? Grace's voice rose slightly. You forfeited any rights when you left without a word. When you made me promises you never intended to keep. The townspeople were watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Grace was aware of Mrs. Parker and Reverend Williams among them, their expressions a mixture of disapproval and morbid curiosity. Robert took another step toward her. Now don't be like that. Maybe I've come back to make good on those promises. She's not interested, Bryce said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable warning. Robert's eyes shifted to Bryce, sizing him up. And who might you be, the replacement? I'm the man who's been here, Bryce replied evenly. While you were off boasting about your conquests along the trail, a flash of anger crossed Robert's face. This is between me and my woman. I am not your woman, Grace stated clearly. I never really was, and Emma is not your concern. Robert's charm vanished, replaced by ugly anger. You think you can deny me my own blood? I could take that child right now if I wanted. You could try, Bryce said, his hand moving to his pistol. The tension in the air thickened. Several townspeople backed away, anticipating violence. Stop this right now, Sheriff Collins pushed through the crowd. Ainsley, you're causing a disturbance, Robert sneered. I'm just claiming what's mine, Sheriff. The lady says otherwise, the sheriff replied, and in my town a lady's word counts for something. Grace was surprised by the sheriff's support. She'd expected him to side with Robert as the town had sided against her for months. This isn't over, Robert spat. I'll be back with papers, legal papers. "No, you won't," said a new voice. "Mrs." Parker stepped forward from the crowd, her usual pinched expression replaced by something fiercer. "Because if you do, I'll testify how you bragged in my store yesterday about the women you'd bedded in 3 different territories. How you specifically said you'd had your fun with Grace Caldwell and moved on." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Robert's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. "And I'll testify how you boasted about never settling down, having too many wild oats to sow," added Mr. Henderson, Bryce's employer, stepping forward as well. "No judge will grant custody to a man like that." Robert looked around, realizing he was losing the upper hand. His charming facade returned, though strained. Now, everyone's misunderstanding. I only meant to do right by Grace and the child." "By threatening to take her baby," Mrs. Tanner called out. The same woman who had condemned Grace in the store now looked at Robert with disgust. "That's not doing right by anyone." Grace was stunned by the sudden shift in the town's attitude. These same people who had shunned her for months were now defending her against Robert. "I think it's time you moved on, Ainsley," Sheriff Collins said firmly. "Your cattle drive leaves at noon." "I suggest you be on it." Robert's gaze shifted between the sheriff, the hostile townspeople, and finally to Grace. Whatever he saw in her face made him step back. "Fine," he said bitterly. "Keep the brat. You'll both regret it when you're struggling to survive." "We won't struggle," Bryce said, moving to stand beside Grace. "Because unlike you, this town takes care of its own." He placed a protective arm around Grace's shoulders, and to her surprise, she leaned into his strength. Robert spat on the ground, then turned and stalked back toward the saloon. The crowd began to disperse, but many lingered, watching Grace with new eyes. Mrs. Parker approached hesitantly. "Miss Caldwell, She seemed at a loss for words. "That baby looks hungry. Perhaps you'd like to come into the store for some milk and a place to sit." The offer, so unexpected after months of open hostility, brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. As they walked toward the store, other townspeople approached, offering awkward words of support or simply nodding in acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning. Inside the store, as Grace fed Emma in a chair Mrs. Parker provided, Bryce stood nearby, his presence steady and reassuring. "You didn't have to stay through all that," Grace said quietly. "Your reputation in town is exactly as I want it to be," he finished for her. "Standing with you was my choice, Grace, just like staying in Redemption Creek is my choice." She looked up at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. Why share in my shame when you could have an easier life?" "Because it's not shame," he said softly. "It's strength, and because—" He hesitated, then continued more firmly. "Because I love you, Grace Caldwell, you and Emma both." Grace's breath caught. "Bryce, you don't need to say anything now," he assured her. "I know you've had men make promises before. I intend to keep mine, however long it takes." Grace reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "It won't take long at all," she whispered. "I think I've been falling in love with you since you said you'd share my burden that day in the store." The winter of 1878 was harsh in Wyoming, but in Grace's cabin, warmth prevailed. Bryce spent Christmas with them, bringing a small pine tree that they decorated with paper stars and dried berries. He moved into the cabin in January, after they were married by a newly supportive Reverend Williams in a small ceremony attended by surprisingly many townspeople. By spring, when the first wildflowers bloomed on the hills around Redemption Creek, Grace was expecting their second child. Emma, now toddling and chattering, followed Bryce adoringly as he expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and reinforcing the roof against the prairie winds. The town's attitude had shifted permanently. Grace was invited to join the Ladies' Aid Society, and Emma played with other children her age. The shame that had once been her constant companion faded, replaced by a quiet pride in the family she and Bryce were building together. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch Bryce had built, watching the sunset paint the western sky in gold and crimson. Emma asleep in her little bed inside, Grace would often read poetry aloud while Bryce carved small animals from wood gifts for Emma and the new baby to come. "I never expected this," Grace admitted one such evening, her hand resting on her growing belly. After everything, to find happiness here in the same place that once felt like a prison. Bryce took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Sometimes the things we carry that feel like burdens turn out to be blessings, he said. Emma led me to you. Your strength showed me what love truly means. Grace leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that the life they shared, the joy, the challenges, the love was built on a foundation of choice rather than obligation. In a wild land that often valued a man's strength above all, Bryce had recognized that true strength came in many forms, including a young mother's determination to create a life of dignity for her child. And in sharing what the world called her shame, he had transformed it into their greatest pride.